欢迎大家回来大声访谈。今天我们是用视频采访的形式。Philip 前一段时间在乌克兰呢，接触到和采访到了一位勇敢美丽的医生，Olesya Vinik。他这次在百忙之中专门花时间要跟我们做一个访谈，所以今天呢，这个也是我第一次一起跟另外一个主持人 Philip Nobel 我们一起来做这个访谈。这个形式很不一般，但不是我最希望的形式。我希望有一天我能到乌克兰前线，去跟更多的乌克兰人，普通人、战士、医生去聊天。但今天在这样一个战事还非常激烈的情况下，我还是第一时间把这个 Vinik 医生给请到了视频前面跟我们聊，而且他的英语非常好，他的这个性格和整个的这种状态一下子让我感受到了乌克兰人的这种人格魅力，所以我们的访谈也很快的从目前正在进行的这个战事开始。Okay, so I just briefly tell people why we're sitting here, and we try to make time to grab you in front of the camera and talk about Ukraine, how you fight, and how you help with the soldiers, how your stories about how people help each other. So just very quickly, I know both of you are very excited about what's going on in the war zone. So what's the latest?
So first of all, it's my great honor to be here. Thank you for having me. For me, by default, it means that you're supporting Ukraine, and it means the world to us right now. Every kind of support is extremely important right now. The latest, I wouldn't say that it's a victory yet, but it's a huge milestone for us. Yesterday, our defense services performed an excellent operation to destroy some of the Russian planes. Who were attacking Ukrainian, mostly civilian population. It was performed in a very unique way. I think that it will be written in the history as one of the attacks that were quite successful and quite wise, I would say. There was no alternatives and no such examples in the history beforehand. So the attack itself was performed by drones, very far away from the border, from Ukrainian and Russian border, and was specifically targeted to destroy Russian aviation planes, so Russian aviation, to protect Ukrainian civilians. And as every Ukrainian operation, it was it required a lot of time. As far as we read right now, it's around 1.5 years to prepare an operation like that. But for us Ukrainians, for civilian Ukrainians, it was so worth it. Because as far as we know, no civilian Russian were killed during this operation, in opposite to what Russians are doing. And it was a huge milestone for us, because something that we wanted to do to protect our population was successful. And I guess that the whole world reading today's news is celebrating together with us.
Definitely was a huge surprise. I think that as we also read in the news, it seems that the Trump administration was not really aware of the preparation. And we understand that, to sort of pull out something as sophisticated and also with actually rather cheap drones that destroy very expensive planes, you have to keep this quite secret. And I think it shows a lot about the character of Ukrainians, the sense of innovation and the sense of never giving up, and the sense that no matter what others say about your country, or that, Putin will take Kiev in 3 days, more than 3 years later, we have been through a horrible war with a lot of people dying in Ukraine. But Ukraine is a free country. Yes, 20% of its territory is occupied, but the spirit is there. And when we met 2 weeks ago in Lviv, that was actually part of our long discussion. How do you explain this spirit? And I think that that's what a lot of people who are not so familiar maybe with the history of Ukraine, Ukrainian mentality, what happened also after the fall of the Soviet Union, why countries that, at least during the Soviet period were in the same political space today are so vastly different, I would say even opposite, like Ukraine and Russia. And so I know it's a big question, but how do you explain or maybe describe, or if you have examples of this resilience and resistance spirit that I think surprised the people who didn't know Ukraine? People who knew Ukraine, I think, are not so surprised, but people who didn't know Ukrainians and Ukraine are still today wondering, including because of this attack, how do you do it?
Thank you for this comment, Philip. First of all, about yesterday's attack, I know some of the soldiers, some of our defenders who are working with different services. And to be honest, when you know them in person, you would not be as surprised with the results of this operation. Those guys are actual heroes to me. And the first thing that you need to know about Russian-Ukrainian war is that that's for Ukrainian, for our side. It's not just about territory or power. It's mostly about our values. And as horrible as it might sound, it's also a beautiful thing to fight for. Because when you have purpose, when you know why are you fighting, it is easier to achieve some goals, especially in medicine. Are we resilient? I don't think so. At least we are resilient not by choice. In order to gain this resilience at war, is to win the war, is the only way to be resilient at war. However, Ukrainians are not afraid to take responsibility. We know how to act if our beloved country is attacked every single day. And if you see the atrocities of this magnitude from our enemies, from the side of our enemies, it's kind of noble to fight on Ukrainian side. And I'm so glad to be on this right side of the history. And I'm so glad that you understand this value. That's our resilience, the purpose itself, the very core of human spirit.
Yeah, can you say more about your values? Because it's very, very important. Because in Chinese, the values could be about your spiritual, pursuit, or it's about some goals, very specific goals, or just some fundamental basic principles. So in your concept, in your context, what are the values? Yeah, can you share more specifically?
Of course, I'll be glad to. So this war started not in 2022 from the full-scale invasion from Russian side, but in 2014 from the revolution called Revolution of Dignity. And here we have our first value, it's dignity. It was not an easy time for healthcare professionals, as I'm a physician. We tried to help our patients as much as possible. But another value that we are driven by is respect for every and each single human life. And it impacts actually every aspect of my work that I do. It's about quality, it's about patience, it's about empathy. So all the values that I'm mentioning is mostly about ethics, about morals. Again, your facing something terrible and you want to do something opposite. It's the nature of human being, and I guess that's something that keeps me waking up every single morning. The purpose, the dignity, the respect, the idea that our soldiers are following, because mostly they're trying to defend us. I mean, Ukraine is a beautiful independent state, which were always very much having this free spirit. We don't want to follow someone others, but we want to be a part of civilized community right now, a civilized world. And this, to end with values, I would say that if Russian side is fighting to regain the power of the past, they're trying to resurrect the past, then we are fighting for the future. We want to be together with the civilized world. We want to be part of innovations, and we want to participate. We are eager to be better. I would say even better as human beings. For physicians to be better physicians, to gain better professional skills. All that together is our value, is our purpose, why we are fighting. Long answer, but that's true.
I believe as a doctor, you have your life goal, you have your career path. So describe me what your life is about. What's your daily work before the full-scale war started?
So, Vivian, I guess this question requires a little story from my side.
Yes.
So when the war started in 2014, I just finished my my med school. So I graduated from Lviv Medical University, and right after that, I was recruited to the Ministry of Health as an advisor. So sometime after that, and so 2017 is the time when the healthcare reform started in Ukraine. That's another thing that you need to know about healthcare in Ukraine, that we are still, even at war, we are still in the process of healthcare reform. So there was a very successful and value-driven group by physicians. The leader was a physician called Uliana Supron. She was Minister of Health. And I'm proud to tell that I was, for a short time, I was part of her team. And actually, I tried to change the primary healthcare level. That's what I did. After that, I worked for WHO, for several international missions in order to help Ukrainian physicians and to help Ukrainian patients. Meanwhile, I gave the consultations online and also during COVID online, of course, then via phone or in the clinic if needed. Then in 2022, when the full-scale invasion started, right after that, the next day, I joined Lviv Medical Volunteer Battalion. That was kind of NGO who tried to help to gain to get some proper equipment for those physicians, civilian physicians or military physicians, who worked near the front line, or for combat medics who were on the front line itself. After that, for more systematic work, I was recruited to Ukrainian World Congress, and we tried to not only to procure some good equipment for healthcare professionals, because quality is key element here. And as I mentioned before, if you respect people enough, you're going to give them the best equipment because they deserve it. If they know how to use it, they deserve to have the best equipment to save lives, right? Beside that, we tried to create some educational opportunities. Once again, the growth, to know your skills, to perfect your skills, right? It was also important not to stay on the same level where we were when the war started, because we want to improve and we want to do something better. As for now, I'm working with medical services of different services in Ukraine, so medical parts of different services of Ukrainian armed forces and so on. And once again, what does it mean? Every single defender, they need to have a little pouch called IFAK, Individual First Aid Kit. As far as we know from wars, according to statistics, almost 90% die on a battlefield because of massive hemorrhage. So they just literally bleed out, right? And soldiers, they need to have this IFAK, this little pouch, with some components in that, with some devices to stop massive hemorrhage. And this thing, this little pouch, made a huge difference on the battlefield during this war. So my job was to build the list of this equipment, make sure that it's the best in quality, and also to make sure that soldiers on the front line, they are able to use it. Because the device only, it's not enough. What's in there, for example, what is commonly known is tourniquet. Cat tourniquet. That's what we need. It's a little device that helps you to stop the bleeding, like to press the vessel in order to stop massive hemorrhage, right? And that's the thing if we are talking about soldiers, about defenders. But it's a whole other thing if we are talking about combat medics. They already know how to use IFAKs, but besides helping themselves, they need to help to the soldiers. It's the very first line of defense near the front line. And once again, they needed portable equipment, such portable ultrasounds, such multiple tourniquets if soldier might lose their IFAK, and so on and so on. So I'm not going to go into details here. However, what you need to know is if you're hunting for the best quality of this equipment, that's extremely expensive. The war itself is extremely expensive from a medical perspective, not just about moral, not just about losing lives, but also a lot of medical equipment is destroyed. Many hospitals, so we talked about defenders, about soldiers, then about combat medics, that's very first line between wounded soldiers and the hospital, and then the hospital itself. Hospitals near the front lines are also in huge danger because we are dealing with enemy who are intentionally targeting hospitals. That's breaking all the basic rules of civilian agreements, of moral agreements, and so on. However, you asked how is that to be a physician near the front line. I'm not myself a physician who are working directly near the front line. However, a lot of my friends are working there, and my job is to help them to get the best equipment, to teach them or to find the possibility to teach them how to use this kind of equipment, and bring some innovations, some inspiration, and to help them as much as possible.
Wow, that's great. So you say you don't wanna go into details, but details really matter. I love listen to more details. So several things. When you say in the beginning of the war, there's a kind of volunteer organization of the medical services people and the doctors. So that organization is organized in international level or national level. In that organization, how many doctors are registered? So you're kind of preparing backup force to make sure the medical support is continuously provided. So tell me more about that. Second question, when you say the equipment have to be good, I totally understand. So I want to just, it's great you have a whole picture of, war zone medical support. So actually it's more important we have a bigger picture. So tell me more about that. It's like how many equipments you really need when you say the equipment have to be good, because the war now is modern level, is more advanced. It's not about the traditional war like we imagine in the Second World War. People are just fighting in a very basic way, or there's a specific requirements for the medical support because the nature of the war is changed. So first two questions, but I have more. But don't worry about details. I love those
Sure.
details.
The first thing you need to know about medicine at war, there is a specific term for that. That's called tactical medicine. And tactical medicine is very, very different from civilian medicine, because it requires a lot of skills from military time. So you need to defend yourself before helping someone else. You need to know how to shoot. You need to know how to act in dangerous situations. And that's something that I, as civilian medic, was never taught in my medical school. Before that invasion, before 2014, I never knew something like tactical medicine at all. And once again, this idea of tactical medicine is a new normal for Ukrainian physicians, both civilian and military. So many doctors are working in their hospitals. So they're still working with soldiers. As I described you, this path of wounded soldier is first they try to help themselves on the battlefield. Then combat medic try to help them as much as possible nearby, or to evacuate them to the stabilization point. It's one more structure, medical structure at war. Then after that, after they eliminated all critical situations, critical wounds or injuries to save the life, right? They tried to evacuate those soldiers to the nearest hospitals. And those healthcare professionals, those physicians who work near the front line, they're civilian physicians. And as they worked in Kharkiv or in Kherson, no matter where, they still have patients with chronic diseases. They still have patients with acute diseases. But additionally to that, they have a huge flow of wounded soldiers and wounded civilians who are evacuated from near the front lines, right? And as you might imagine, logistically, those hospitals are crowded. It's full. They are full with patients. That's why they need to stabilize the patient as soon as possible, and then send them, for example, to Lviv, which is relatively safe. What's need highlighting here? It's relatively safe, because no town around Ukraine is safe at all. We don't know when the next attack might happen. I hope not during this show, and I'll still be able to talk to you guys. However, they try to evacuate patients to other hospitals, and then, if needed, those patients are evacuated abroad for some rehabilitations or things like that. That's the whole path. Frontline, stabilization point, hospital near the front line, then some hospital in a relatively safe area, and then abroad if needed. That's the whole chain of healthcare help support from Ukrainian side. How many physicians are registered, or how many people are involved in this process is almost impossible to count. Some of this information is classified because military doctors are in huge danger, and they're working every single day with huge losses. If it comes to civilian medics, it's like a regular healthcare system that existed before war. What I might mention here, that during the war, as far as our Ministry of Health is announcing, more than 200 civilian medics, civilian healthcare professionals were killed by Russians. As you might understand, that's also a huge psychological impact for healthcare professionals. For this reason, we have a huge problem with burnout. We have many healthcare professionals who were forced to flee Ukraine. So the system is struggling. It is extremely challenging to overcome such difficulties. However, we are trying to make it work. We are trying to get our physicians who left Ukraine to go back to Ukraine, to create more opportunities to them, to encourage them to go back to Ukraine. It's not easy, but we are trying to do that. That's about your first question. I don't know if I answered your question. But from my perspective, I used to work, give some consults before war, being more involved in healthcare management. With the beginning of this war, I was forced to give up my practice entirely because I wanted to be as useful as possible and to help Ukrainian physicians as much as possible with the equipment. Because when the war started, the biggest problem was with the equipment. It should be portable, it should be innovative, it should be in good working conditions, because many hospitals are destroyed and people still need healthcare support. They still need healthcare to function at its best. But it's almost impossible to fully resign when you're a physician. So a lot of my friends are still calling me, and I'm still doing my clinical work from time to time. And I really hope that we will be able to win this war as soon as possible. And my dream will come true, that I will go back to my clinical practice and be a physician as I'm trained to be.
Yeah.
So indeed, doctors in Ukraine have multiple roles. And as you said, you were not prepared initially when you were studying, because of course no one was, thinking of a war in the middle of Europe in the 21st century. But I think that, as in many other areas of Ukraine, what strikes me is that precisely it's also about individuals taking on the responsibilities, and whether the state is there to support or half there, or as you said, because you came out of a Soviet system and so you had a Soviet healthcare with a lot of issues. And again, in the middle of this war, and as you said, at least 200 civilian doctors who died, you're still also reforming the entire system. And I think that that's also something that is often not visible in the news, because, the news focus on the war itself, on the front line, and then forget, also the daily life that is sometimes very heroic, sometimes very dramatic, also painful. But at the same time, you're doing something that, sounds from the outside a little bit boring, like, let's reform our health system. You kind of like, how do you do this? It's not very exciting. But I know you care a lot about this issue, And when we were talking, Lviv, you also mentioned this other aspect of your work, which I think is quite unusual, which is called medical diplomacy. So can you explain what is medical diplomacy? What does it mean?
Thank you for this question. Actually, when it comes to healthcare reform, it's also part of our worldview. It's not just the time to do that, but what we wanted to do is to get rid of that Soviet Union way of thinking in healthcare and to make it actually functioning. We wanted to join international medical community. We wanted to contribute equally. That's why in 2017 we started this healthcare reform, once again thanks to brilliant healthcare minister Ulyana Sutrova. At war, it's not just about losses of human life. So I guess it's much more, because we're not counting military medics, military healthcare professionals, right? It's just about registered death of those physicians, civilian physicians who were killed at war. But it's also about damaged, I guess, 1,500 medical facilities were partially destroyed or damaged, and about 200 were completely destroyed. Can you imagine being in the middle of healthcare reform while the facilities are destroyed, while people are dying, while we are under constant intentional attack? That's a very important thing to know, because that leads to the next question, Philip, about medical diplomacy. Why Russian medics cannot participate in international medical conferences or things like that? Because as for me, it's incredibly hypocritical, right? So you're, as physician, you're trying to declare values, you're trying to save as much human lives as possible, and at the same time, if you're a Russian physician, you're in silent agreement with something that their president is doing. That was my huge problem, because when the war started, of course, many Ukrainian physicians, including me, were invited to go to international medical conferences and talk about how the healthcare works at all, right? And those healthcare professionals, international healthcare professionals, they didn't know how it's possible to work, but also they think that the only bridge left to negotiate with Russian representatives are to include them and to hear their point of view. Unfortunately, that's absolutely not true, because as this war is not just about military actions, it's also about cultural actions and about the huge propaganda that Russian population is drowning in. And it's the huge problem, as unfortunately, as for now, I haven't met a single Russian doctor who stood out and spoke up about their beliefs, condemning everything that their president is doing. I mean, who else if not Russian population? That's also about responsibility and their personal responsibility as physicians. Once again, it's my area, that's why I'm talking about that. That's where medical diplomacy were born. I was invited to different medical conferences talking about what the healthcare look like at war, and at the same time I tried to explain why it is an important part of supporting Ukraine to exclude Russian representatives from any platforms, any medical platforms, and to let them know that if they are not ready to take responsibility, there will be consequences. And they need to deal with their president, was this kind of propaganda that is unfortunately still going on in Russia, and they need to fight it internally. As far as I know, there are many like sub-nationalities in Russia, subpopulations who want to be independent and who want to fight against this cruel propaganda that is going on in Russia. And by encouraging this kind of behavior, when physicians are going to international platforms and condemning what is happening in Ukraine, we want to include, we want to launch kind of movement that is that goes along with our values, that goes along with our purpose, and some of those actions were successful. For example, a big journal, British Medical Journal, BMJ, and they tried to encourage Ukrainian physicians to submit some articles. However, they tried to set apart a little bit of Russian authors. I guess it's a very brave thing to do. Same as, for example, I went to a conference in Copenhagen, and they were incredibly supportive, and some Russian representatives tried to participate. However, the official statement was like, we are not going to talk with representatives of an aggressor state. And that's the biggest support possible for Ukrainian physicians. Unfortunately, when it comes to financial part, not all people are as supportive as they are on their words. However, this kind of behavior helps to understand Ukrainian mentality and helps to to show the bully that it's not a good thing to do in 21st century. Something that they are doing right now is not acceptable. And if the whole world would do something like that, so my area is medical area. However, if every other areas would do their part, I guess we might show Russians that their actions, their regression, will not be well received, will not be accepted in a civilized world and in the world where our children will